Previously on Transformers University, we took a look at Season 1 of the Generation 1 cartoon, and now we take a step into 1985 as we kick off the second semester of Transformers University. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode number 14 of Transformers University. I am your host, Anthony Brucali, and today we are continuing our way into the second semester of Transformers University, kicking off 1985 in content with the second season of the Transformers cartoon. And today we're going to cover 5 episodes. We're going to talk about Autobot Spike. We're going to talk about Changing Gears. We're going to talk about City of Steel. We're going to talk about the attack of the Autobots. And we're going to talk about Traitor. And I've got some great guests lined up for you today. But before we jump into the meat and potatoes part of this class, we are going to talk a little bit about a couple of new things at TFU.INFO that I just really want you to know about. Number one, we have a contest going. And I know I've been promising many of you listeners a contest. So if you swing on by to our YouTube page, there's a video already up for the contest. That is youtube.com/TFU.INFO, TFU.INFO. There you will find the video about the contest. We are doing a giveaway as we try to get to 1,000 subscribers. All you got to do, subscribe to the YouTube channel. That simple. Go to the YouTube page, youtube.com/TFU.INFO. Click subscribe, and you are in. If we get to 500, I give away 3 Transformers. We get to 750, I toss in a 4th, and we get to 1,000, I toss in a Studio Series Thundercracker, Toys R Us exclusive toy that you will probably have trouble finding right now, and you will really have trouble finding when Toys R Us closes for good. Additionally, if you want a little bit of an edge on that contest, you want to get a couple more entries, we've also launched a Patreon for the podcast listeners and the website users. If you swing on by to patreon.com/TFU.INFO, anyone who joins the Patreon at any level, all the levels are between $1 and $10 a month, and that will get you some exclusive access to this show as well as some other shows. It'll get you the podcasts at least a day early as far as Transformers University is concerned, and it'll get you deeper involved in the program here. So you can sign up at any level. We have a freshman level, we have a sophomore level, we have a junior, senior, super senior, and graduate level. And actually I misspoke a little bit a few seconds ago. The graduate level is a $50 level, but that one will allow you to pick a topic for this show or for TFU News and Views. So swing on by to Patreon, patreon.com/TFU.INFO for more details. Okay, enough house cleaning here. So we are going to jump into Season 2, and Season 2 kicks off the first episode of the season, 17th episode overall, is Autobot Spike. And that one is written by Donald F. Glut, who we've mentioned here before, has quite an interesting history and backstory. And one of those pieces of history is that he was a horror movie aficionado, and still is. He's not dead. He's alive. And he did make his mark at a young age making amateur horror films, so much so that he gained a bit of notoriety, at least this is what I've read on Wikipedia, and went so far as, through this notoriety, was able to hire Glenn Strange, the man who played the Frankenstein monster in 3 Universal horror films, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, and a personal favorite of mine, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. And so Glenn Strange actually performed in one of Glut's shorts called Frankenstein's Fury. And this is all important because this episode, Autobot Spike, is essentially a Frankenstein story, so much so that they mention it several times in the episode. In this episode, there's actually even a scene where Spike, as Autobot X, is watching a Frankenstein movie on TV. So the basic plot of this episode is that Sparkplug builds a Frankenstein Autobot out of spare parts and tries to bring it to life, and it comes alive, and then it attacks all the Autobots, and they put it down. But by putting him down, the Autobots have this body that they think they can one day transfer a mind into in case anyone gets too physically damaged and needs to have their mind transferred before being repaired. And without getting into too much detail, that eventually happens this episode, and the person who gets hurt is Spike, so they transfer Spike's mind into the body of Autobot X, which is the Frankenstein body built by Sparkplug. That is your basic plot. That is the outline. And for more detail and for how this episode had a bit more of an effect on him than most people, I'm going to toss it over to my buddy, Gabriel Owens, the Salty Seaman.
I created a monster, cause nobody wants to see Marshall no more. They want shady, I'm chopped liver. Well, if you want shady, this is what I'll give you.
Hey folks, Gabriel Owens, the Salty Seaman here, talking about Autobot Spike. I asked to do this episode because I was reminded, this episode really creeped me out as a kid. I just rewatched it a couple of years ago, and then I'm just sitting down now to rewatch it again. And I still have those same feels from it before. And, and I know it's just another goofy, just one-off season 2 episode. And it's a Frankenstein story, and as a kid, I knew it was a Frankenstein story. It was, they make sure to let you know it's a Frankenstein story. But there's something about the whole aspect of Spike getting put in this creature and basically losing his mind. And I think it was just Spike being so out of character and seeming in such pain. I think really affected me as a kid. One of the interesting things to watch in this episode is when you watch Autobot X or Spike, who eventually gets put into him, it's figuring out where all his parts come from. If you watch the episode, he is set. Sparkplug builds him out of Autobot parts, spare parts, and the animation does go through trouble of trying to make them recognizable, Autobots who existed. I mean, Hound's missile launcher is, the first one you could really notice. And I'm sure I could go online and find a complete list of recognized parts. Some are just generic, but at the same time, I think that's a really cool part of the episode. One of those things that always stuck out. The doors in the back for a robot that doesn't transform. The car doors, which could be half dozen characters. I think it's still a fun touch because it's an Autobot, and half the Autobots have car doors just hanging off their back, which battle technique wise is a very dumb thing to have. But I digress. This is not one of my military movie BSs I do on my own channel, The Salty Seaman. Another interesting part of this is this episode kind of feeds into the whole belief, the whole thing for creating Transformer life that was present in the first season. Which that makes sense. This is basically a continuation of season 1. There's no, this early on in the season, the new characters aren't really showing up yet. I don't think they really show up till Dinobot Island. But it's basically there's some intent there that essentially Sparkplug was going to create life just out of spare parts and transistors and diodes. Okay, now if this were a military movie bullshit episode, this Air Force base would I could spend 5 minutes picking it apart, but I won't. There's also a nice scene in here where the Autobots drive up to the gate, which has the arm down. And you're expecting Optimus Prime to bust through it, as he is known to do, bust through things, as a big Arkliner truck that he is. But he stops out of respect for the military's gate. Prime, you are, in many overt and subtle ways, a true hero. As a former enlisted guy who would have to clean up that mess and probably repair that arm, I appreciate you, Optimus. Bumblebee, however, later on in the episode, doesn't have the same respect for the arm gate. There's also a rare scene of Soundwave using Megatron's gun form, which, of course, longtime fans know is classically Starscream's gig, but Starscream wasn't in this battle. And another thing I really liked is there's a very... I guess it's the line reading. I don't think it's what was intended, but as they're trying to get Autobot Spike under control, Autobot X, as he's trashing Autobot headquarters, and Sideswipes goes, "He's out of control again." Just kind of matter of fact, I don't know if he's implying. I guess it's supposed to imply that Autobot X is destroying everything, but it makes it sound like Spike. Spike just kind of, constantly goes around and destroys Autobot headquarters. But I don't know. The line reading I thought was pretty funny. There's also a nice touch in this episode where they actually return to the base and help the humans clean up. I think always a point of contention is like, with TV shows of this type, comic books and whatnot, who cleans up all these big battles? So it's nice to see the Autobots taking responsibility for, even though they were on the defensive, they're still like, hey, we should go help these humans, these poor enlisted people like myself who have to go fix this shit. Let's go help them out. It's the least we can do. So I appreciate that. And there's another funny bit in the episode where the Decepticon underground headquarters pops up next to some, which I guess are the Rocky Cliffs of Oregon near the Autobot headquarters. Like Laserbeak was spying on the Autobots as he is wont to do. And usually they depict the Decepticon base just kind of being in the middle of the ocean. And this time the raising tower comes out of the water right next to the shoreline, which I don't remember ever seeing it do it. I guess it's like the tree in the Simpsons' backyard. It's where they need it to be. And, as mentioned, this episode is Frankenstein. It's not subtle about it at all. In fact, there is a Autobot Spike at one point with bolts in his neck watches a version of Frankenstein, which is not Hammer House nor the classic Universal movies. I'm really interested. I want to see this version of Frankenstein. I love classic horror movies, and the version shown in the show, I'm like, oh, I want to see this version. Voice acting sounds pretty good.
I beg of you, Dr. Frankenstein, do not go through with this unholy experiment. This creation of yours, made from mismatching parts and an evil brain, is a monster who will destroy us all!
Nonsense! He will be grateful for the giant, powerful body I've given him.
You see, Doctor, you've created a monster! A monster!
And finally, the tagline of the episode is Bumblebee wondering aloud what would happen if a robot mind got transferred to a human, which we would see eventually in season 3 with only human. Possibly one of the more famous episodes of the series, but we're a long way from that one. But overall, yeah, it's still creepy. It's something about the way Burton does the Autobot Spike voice, just how weirdly bipolar he is. And I don't know, maybe it woke up some kind of just, childhood trauma I had. But like the whole thing with Spike just always, still to this day, unnerves me, just the whole way it's done. So on that respect, other people probably didn't have the same effect. But for me personally, it definitely did. And it was always an ep that creeped me out. It would be one I would skip. Like if it was in reruns, I would go watch something else or play with my toys or whatever. Anyway, that's all I got for the Salty Seaman on Autobot Spike. And now back over to Ant.
And of course, you can catch Gabe on his YouTube channel, The Salty Seaman, over on YouTube. So swing on by, search it out, and check it out. And, Gabe makes a lot of really interesting points there, and one of the things he mentioned about Corey Burton's voice acting, and it's something I should have prefaced this episode with, but I'll mention it here. Usually before we jump into a cartoon season or a significant chunk of a cartoon season, I like to do a Meet the Cast episode of this show, and the first 10 episodes of season 2 doesn't really have that many new cast members and has 0 new Transformers, except maybe Autobot X, which is also technically Spike. So we will be doing a season 2 Meet the Cast episode later on, but probably not until after we've made our way through the first 10 episodes. So, a little bit more about Autobot Spike while we're at it. There's a couple interesting little animation and trivia things that I just thought I'd mention. When Ratchet takes Spike to the hospital, Prowl provides a police escort, but no one provided a way for Spike to get out of Ratchet once they got to the hospital. During one of the battles, it's also interesting to note that Optimus mounts his gun onto his shoulder like a bazooka, which I don't think we will ever see him do again, and I'm pretty sure we've never seen him do before. Reflector gets his final spoken lines of the series. From here on out, you will only see him and his multiple bodies, but he does not speak in any of the final versions of the show. And I think, yeah, that's about all the notes I have for some of the fun things. Oh, and let's just break down the makeup of Autobot X as described by TFWiki.net and my friends over there. So from what people can pick out of his components on his body, he has Prowl's forehead crest and right chest / front bumper, Blue Streak's left door, Sunstreaker's left shoulder, Hound's shoulder-mounted missile launcher and right fender / shoulder, Trailbreaker's arm cannon, left chest and left thigh, Optimus's left wrist and parts of his right leg, and then Jazz's photon rifle, which is mounted on his right arm, as well as Jazz's left leg and the crotch of Jazz. And that is the build of Autobot Spike. And another interesting thing to note that I've noticed a theme, and maybe I've assigned this theme to these 5 episodes, there's a bit of homage to old movies across these next 5 episodes, counting Autobot Spike. So Autobot Spike is clearly the Frankenstein one. And as we pivot to changing gears, it's very similar to a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of concept. So let's move on to episode 2, Changing Gears. 18th episode overall in the U.S. run of the series. This one was written by Larry Parr. Now, I had to do a lot of research to figure out what Larry Parr has done since. His IMDb page is fairly incorrect in that it has merged him with another Larry Parr. And that Larry Parr in particular that he has been merged with on IMDb is a movie director from New Zealand, and that is not the Larry Parr that wrote Changing Gears. So what I was able to find on Larry Parr that I feel is fairly accurate is he was an animation writer in the 1980s. Wrote on The Smurfs, wrote on Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, also another Sunbow show. He was story editor on G.I. Joe, another Sunbow show. And he wrote Pride of the X-Men, the animated movie, which again was also Sunbow. Currently, he is a freelance writer. He has some murder mysteries on Amazon, and I will link to those in the show notes here. So if you're interested in checking out his books or looking at them, they're there. He is also, as a business, has a dog training how-to series that you can find online. And he, speaking of how-tos, he writes a lot of freelance articles on how to do things these days. For example, he's written a how-to called How to Prevent Sports Injuries, How to Wind a Rolex, How to Sterilize a Needle, How to Use Lightning Rods to Make Glass on the Beach, How to Stop a Snowmobile Helmet from Fogging. And he has also other how-to articles such as How to Trim Male Pubic Hair, or How to Use Yogurt as a Cure for Bacterial Vaginosis. So that is what Larry Parr is up to these days. And the interesting thing for me watching Changing Gears for the first time in a very, very long time is that this episode was really good for an episode that has a very basic plot premise, and that is Gears is grumpy. And, you know, in the process of the Decepticons going to build their MacGuffin for the episode, which is, in this case, something Megatron calls the Solar Needle, he realizes that Gears' personality component, it's a special circuit, as they called it in the episode, is the last piece he needs to complete this machine, and plugs it into the machine to get it to work. Now, this thing harnesses solar power from the sun's core, and in the process of this, Megatron kidnaps Gears in order to get the personality component, and it changes Gears from grumpy to this weird sort of happy, though bubbling, angry underneath. And he is certainly happy and agreeable. And we find out through the course of the episode that because of this solar needle, the sun will explode in 2 hours. And Megatron has this needle at the center of Africa, and it's something I noticed that was odd. And so did Rob Clay of Radio Free Cybertron and T-Formers. So here he is with a bit more.
Hey everybody, it's Rob Clay from Radio Free Cybertron and Tformers.com. And Anthony asked if I'd like to come on and talk about a G1 episode, talk about some cartoons for once, since I'm usually one of the toy guys on RFC, and sounded like fun. So I went with Changing Gears. It's the one where the Autobots drive to Africa from the Ark, which is usually presumed to be in Southwest America, in less than 2 hours. And every time you see them on screen, they are driving at fairly road safe, street legal kind of speed. So yeah, even with that goofiness aside, it's a pretty fun episode. Don Messick does a really good job playing the cheerfully passive-aggressive Gears, who has had his grumpiness personality component stolen by Megatron to power his doomsday weapon. And besides that slightly goofy conceit, and besides the goofiness of driving to Africa, it's actually a solid little action episode. I'm sure it didn't win any kind of awards for animation quality, honestly. But there's some pretty decent scenes here and there, and at least one of the keyframe animators really obviously liked kicks, because there's some pretty nice dynamic kicking and other, hand-to-hand fighting during the episode. Between that and the heavy reuse of stock footage, hope you like that close-up of Starscream getting smacked in the face, because you're going to see it at least twice. I think that it's a really good example of animators on a low-budget show making the best of what they have.
And you can catch Rob Clay on the Radio Free Cybertron Network and at T-Formers, and of course on his own fairly irregular podcast, Rob Clay, Toy Detective, on the Radio Free Cybertron Network, and that's over at tfradio.net. And Rob noticed one of the things I thought was kind of fun in this episode is that, of course, if Megatron is located, quote, in the geographic center of Africa, that the Autobots would drive there and need to get there in under 2 hours. So I did a little math, and so let's say they're somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. To get to the center of Africa, which I'm putting somewhere in the middle of the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's roughly 8,800 miles direct to drive there, and that is driving over water. For my friends using the metric system, that is about a bit over 14,000 kilometers, and at 100 miles an hour, it would take about 3.7 days to drive, so a little more than 3.5 days, almost 3 3/4 days, to drive that directly over water in a car. And so to use some very, very rough math and an online distance calculator, the Autobots, to get there in just under 2 hours, would have to be traveling at about 4,500 miles an hour. So let's put that bit of science aside. So a couple other interesting notes in this episode. So the Autobots get to Africa. There's a lot of fighting. One of the things I noticed in the fight sequences is that Cliffjumper actually jumps off a cliff in this episode, very literally to his name. And there's another interesting thing is when they get to Africa, there's what they call in the voice and acting world, Walla. Now, Walla is kind of when a bunch of the voice actors all speak at the same time to kind of create the sound like there's a bit of noise. And I could just explain it to you, but just listen for Peter Cullen at the end of this one.
Autobots, forward!
It's very clearly Ironhide saying, "Let's get it on." And so there's a lot of fighting at the Needle, and the Autobots eventually deactivate the Needle, and Gears gets his personality back, despite his team's minor objections to him being grumpy again. And that brings us to the third episode of the season, episode 19 overall, City of Steel, written by Douglas Booth. You may remember him back from our first episode on the cartoon, as he had written Roll For It. He had also written Fire on the Mountain, and eventually becomes noted for writing some of the more wacky Transformers Season 2 episodes, including this one. Remember how I said each episode vaguely resembles a well-known movie or story? This one is clearly the King Kong homage, and it is also the first episode animated by a studio called ACOM, who would go on to animate a number of the episodes of G1, seasons 2 and 3, and they're known for kind of being sloppy and kind of not being really good. So the ACOM episodes tend to really stand out. There's a lot of animation errors in this episode, and there's a lot of logical errors in this episode. So this episode takes place in New York. The Constructicons plan to drop the Empire State Building underground and replace it with a Cybertronian-styled Empire State Building as Megatron tries to take over New York City. And that is the gist of this episode. And for more on some of the wackiness and some of the things that have just lived on beyond this episode's life, we're going to chat with Jen Alm of the Stasis Pod podcast and Iacon Underground for a bit more.
You know, there are some episodes that are really well animated and some that are really well written, and this one is neither. It's one of those episodes that was never really well regarded. It's definitely one of those episodes that when it would come on in the early BotCons, when it would come on in the video room, people would leave because it just wasn't worth hanging around for. So it's definitely always been considered one of the sillier episodes. The thing about this episode, I looked up the writer. It's Douglas Booth, who did do some episodes that were pretty well written, but this episode, it's like there are all these one-liners that just fall flat, or bits of dialogue that seem to be intended to be funny that just fall flat. Megatron finds out the Autobots are coming to deal with the fact that the Empire State Building has just withdrawn into the ground. And he calls over Scavenger and Long Haul. He's like, your special talents are required for a welcome the Autobots will find terminal.
Scavenger, Long Haul! Your special talents are required for a welcome the Autobots will find terminal.
It's like, dude, it wasn't that funny. So Megatron captures Optimus Prime and just completely dismembers him, sets his feet off in a corner somewhere. He turns the rest of his body into this alligator because it takes place in New York City and it was the 80s and alligators in the sewer, which is a really cool idea for all of 2 minutes maybe total screen time. And then he takes his arm, and he thinks this is the most clever idea he has ever had. And he takes his arm with the gun and puts it on top of the Empire State Building that he has rebuilt into this Cybertronian thing somehow with 6 guys. And basically that's their weapon emplacement on top of it is, haha, it's Optimus Prime's arm with the gun. Well, and then they leave Optimus Prime's head unguarded, so the Autobots just show up and take it and get it close enough that, it's haha, we're shooting at you with your own arm. But they get close enough to it, and of course Optimus takes control of it and shoots Devastator with it, because of course Devastator is there, and that's it. So it's like, yeah, that was a really poorly considered plan, but I guess also it's like hella dark. It's like he gets dismembered and none of that is treated with the gravity you would expect. And one of the most notorious bits, the one that I've always liked to throw out there, is when they get the alligator con under control and a couple of the Autobots are carrying it to where they can take it back apart, and two of them at the same time say, this alligator con is big and heavy, and Optimus's disembodied head says, from the looks of things, I'd say a little of both.
This alligator is big and heavy. From the looks of it, I'd say a little of both.
Yes, that's literally what they just said, Optimus. Thank you. So yeah, it's one of those episodes that is not even very well regarded for a G1 episode.
And you can catch Jen on her own podcast, Stasis Pod, along with Rob London, who's appeared on the show previously, as well as their other host, David, who I plan on having on here eventually. So, David, if you're listening, let's touch base. As they go through, they start with Beast Wars, which is the 1996 Transformers cartoon, and one of my all-time favorites. And it's going to be a while till we get to Beast Wars here. So they are already making their way through Transformers Prime, which is the 2010, I think that show started. So they've made their way through a bunch of cartoon series, and they go episode by episode. Each episode is a podcast, and it's a great listen, so you should check it out. So continuing with City of Steel, as a native New Yorker and someone who grew up in New York in the 80s when this episode was new, there's a lot of weirdly interesting things here and things that are just not possible. Of course, the Autobots drove to New York from wherever they were, presumably in the Pacific Northwest, and somehow still ended up there on the water. So they drove from the west and went east, and unless they decided to hop into the Hudson River to get to Manhattan Island, which apparently they do because they approach it from the south, they got off land to get into the water, and of course their cars on skis. So let's put all of that aside. And the reason I know they're south is because they drive past the Statue of Liberty. Another weird little thing about New York, when you see the Empire State Building drop into the ground in this episode, it's on the corner of one block, and the Empire State Building is much bigger than that as far as its footprint goes. It actually takes up an entire, almost half a city block, I believe it is. But that goes from one street to another, and on the entire side facing an avenue. So it has 34th Street on one side, it faces the avenue on one side, and then it faces 35th Street on the other, or 33rd Street. It's one or the other. Anyway, but the Empire State Building, as portrayed in this episode, is actually smaller than the real thing. In other funny, weird notes, there's a "Meet me in Central Park" line, which, again, Central Park is enormous. To, let's just say, meet me in Central Park would not be possible. And in Central Park, we get a rare appearance by Frenzy. Megatron uses the word minicon for the first time, and I think the only time in G1, but that word comes back as a faction and race of Transformers in 2002. So it's just interesting to see this word actually has a very old G1 origin.
And if you were to fear one minicon, I'll melt Optimus Prime down for paper clips.
As far as the voice cast goes, we have a female news anchor who I believe is voiced by Arlene Banas, and when we do a Meet the Cast episode, I'll give you a bit more on her. Also in this episode had a huge cast. Buzzsaw made a rare appearance as well. And the last thing worth mentioning, and these both tie back to something that came out later, there are battle taxis in this episode. And man, if there was ever one thing I would like to see get made, okay, there's a lot of things I would like to see get made by Hasbro. Drone battle taxis that transform would definitely be high up on that list. So Megatron in this episode has an army of robotic taxi cabs, checkered cabs at that, and it's just pretty awesome. Also, at the end of the episode, after the Autobots save the day and rebuild Optimus and save New York, the Autobots transform and drive off, and Bumblebee drives at the camera, and we see he has an I Heart New York sticker on his front bumper. And that was a big campaign growing up here in New York. You heard that song a lot. It was meant for New York tourism. It was meant to generate tourism around the country. So I'm guessing around the country you heard it as well. And that campaign actually started in 1977. And if they had tried to do it now, it might be a bit harder, as New York State now licenses out that logo, the I Heart New York logo. And they've been doing so since 1994. And why I say these two things are kind of important to something that shows up later on, not in the show, but just in terms of Transformers product. At New York Comic Con one year, Hasbro released a New York Comic Con exclusive set of toys for Transformers Prime, so different characters, but Bumblebee turned into an NYC taxi, and in that set included two PVC versions of their human partners from that show, and they both had shirts on that said, they had the I, instead of the heart, they had an Autobot logo, and NY, so they were I Autobot New York, done in the style of I Heart New York, or I Love New York. And that takes us to episode 4 of season 2, and that would be Attack of the Autobots, episode 20 overall. This one, written by David Wise, and that name's going to be very important as we go through the rest of G1. David Wise, the most prolific writer of G1 cartoon episodes, this being his first of 15 episodes. And Wise was a bit of a prodigy as a child. He appeared on TV for making his own amateur films. Started making films at the age of 7 and was lecturing about films by the age of 9. He got his start in animation at the age of 16, writing for Star Trek, the animated series. He also wrote 9 episodes of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and then went on to be a writer and the story editor for the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon. And the thing about David Wise as a writer is let's say he goes green. He likes to recycle. And boy, does he recycle stories. This one, probably notwithstanding. So the story starts out with the Autobots attacked at their base. Megatron and Starscream use invisibility spray to enter the Autobot base and sabotage their recharging chambers, which are essentially little bed pods. And it's kind of interesting to see that the Autobots had these kind of beds to recharge and to basically sleep in. So I guess they do sleep. Whether or not they dream of electric sheep is up for debate. But by sabotaging these chambers, Megatron can now control the Autobots. Fortunately, Jazz and Bumblebee were both off-site for the day, and Jazz is working on showing off his new sound system and his rear-mounted speakers. They get back to the base. Blue Streak fights Jazz as the other Autobots attack an Air Force base. There we meet solar satellite designer Dr. Harding, voiced by Morgan Lofting. And of course, more on her when we do get to a Meet the Cast episode. But you probably know her best as the Baroness on G.I. Joe. She is chased by Ratchet and Hound as Jazz and Sparkplug and Spike figure out a way to cure the other Autobots. Eventually, Bumblebee will fight Optimus Prime at the base. Prime splits into his component parts in here, which is something you don't normally see. Combat Deck and Roller. You don't really see either one, particularly Combat Deck. But Bumblebee gets Optimus to eventually change back to his good self. But the Decepticons have hijacked a rocket. The Autobots board Skyfire, intercept the rocket, and disable it to save the day. And going back a little bit, as I mentioned, David Wise loves to recycle. He went on to reuse this, not this plot, but a very similar rocket chase scene in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles episode Slash, the Evil Turtle from Dimension X. Dig up that one on YouTube and do a little compare and contrast. You might see a lot of similarities. And as I've been talking about this entire time, if the previous episodes all were homage to other movies, Attack of the Autobots certainly has a bit of an invasion of the body snatchers kind of feel to it, especially with the pods being the recharging chambers, which are essentially pods, being sabotaged and then warping the Autobots' minds. And that would take us to Traitor, which I was having a hard time trying to figure out what movie this might be. I mean, it fits a number of things, but I also had to think of things that predated this particular episode. And the closest I think I could come was The Manchurian Candidate, which, if you haven't seen, very good movie, stars Frank Sinatra. And without getting too deep into what it's about brainwashing and about the idea of being a traitor or having a traitor in your midst. And this episode was written by George Hampton and Mike Moore, and I cannot find anything on them other than the fact that they wrote a few other cartoons, including Thundercats, for a couple episodes. But they're always credited together, and there's not a lot of information on these two. And it makes me wonder if maybe these names are an alias for another writer. Why another writer would need a ghostwriter name or a alias to pen a cartoon, I am not necessarily sure of a good reason, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. So, let's get into Traitor. And this one is really important as far as if you're a fan of either Cliffjumper or Mirage. A lot of what people remember about those two characters kind of stems from this episode. To start the episode off, Decepticons, of course, steal something from a lab, namely electro shells from the Experimental Energy Research Laboratory, and that is the EERL. And the next day, Cliffjumper is shown returning from patrol. Says he's found the electro shells in the same location that Mirage had searched the day before. And this is what sets up Mirage versus Cliffjumper. And Cliffjumper believing that Mirage is a traitor. Eventually, the Autobots and Decepticons battle at this location. Mirage is defeated by Skywarp and then steals Skywarp's Decepticon badge in the midst of the fight. And using his invisibility powers, uses it to frame up the Decepticons with the Insecticons, who the Decepticons had brought in to help in the fight and had paid them off with Energon cubes. Over the course of doing this, Cliffjumper believes that Mirage is actually working for the Decepticons because he sees them with the Energon cubes and doesn't really see much else other than him going invisible and fleeing the scene. So it's interesting to note here that this story isn't just based around Mirage's betrayal or perceived betrayal of the Autobots, but it's also based around the Insecticons' perceived betrayal by the Decepticons and Mirage's plan. So we have a couple of layers here, which makes this story a little deeper than your average 80s cartoon. And for some, the Insecticons were a major part of this episode. And for more on that, we're going to toss to Miguel from Steel City Bots as he gives his take on why the Insecticons are so important.
One of the things I love most about this episode are the Insecticons. As much as this episode focuses on Cliffjumper's accusation that Mirage is a traitor, the Insecticons, I feel, are something that I really take away from this episode. You have still their relationship with the rest of the Decepticons is pretty rocky, where Mirage is able to take advantage of that by stealing the Energon cubes and causing the infighting at the later half of the episode. You also get the first appearance of Bombshell's Cerebro Shells, sort of showing off those gadgets and powers that a lot of the G1 bots have in the cartoon, which make them very memorable. So that's certainly one of the reasons why I really enjoy this episode, and something that I think about when I remember this episode.
And you can catch Miguel on the Steel City Bots podcast, wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And that's part of the Nerdy Geek Talk network of shows. If you like Transformers, if you like Star Wars, if you like Marvel, check out their shows. Lots of good stuff there. And like Miguel said, this episode is probably equally as important for the Insecticons as it is the Autobots, Mirage and Cliffjumper. And one of the interesting, weird little bits in here is that one of Shrapnel's lines is delivered without the special effects that you normally hear on the Insecticons, and it sounds odd because he repeats syllables at the end of each sentence, and without the special effect, it sounds strange. But here, give it a listen.
They're firing on us. It's a Decepticon ambush.
Okay, so as for the rest of the story, the Decepticons catch Mirage in the act. He's actually damaged by one of Shrapnel's shrapnel weapons, and the Decepticons use Bombshell's Cerebro Shell to control Mirage as Megatron figures out Mirage's plan. So they use Mirage to lure the Autobots into a trap, and during that, Cliffjumper actually uses the phrase, "my Cybro polygraph," which I guess is a Transformers equivalent of a BS detector. Mirage leads them into the trap. Cliffjumper figures this out, knocks out Mirage, where Ratchet finds the Cerebro Shell implanted in Mirage's head, and then Autobots regroup and win because Megatron decides that if he can't have the Electro cells, then no one can, so he blows them up. And surprisingly, the animation in this episode is really good, and maybe it's just a hangover effect from City of Steel a few episodes before, but there's a lot of good animation, except for the final scene where Cliffjumper lays on top of Mirage. It flops over in his lap, and then they wrestle. It's very just weird looking final scene. And on that weird note, we are going to wrap up this edition of Transformers University. As always, if you like the site, you like the show, you have a lot of ways to help. Don't forget, we've got that fantastic contest over on YouTube. All you got to do is go over to YouTube and subscribe. www.youtube.com/TFU.INFO. Follow that link. It'll be in the description of the show as well. Follow that link and click subscribe. It's all you got to do to enter the contest. You got until May 5th, 2018 to enter. But why wait? Do it now. And if you're already a subscriber on YouTube, guess what? You're already entered. And if you want some extra entries, again, swing on by to Patreon. Patreon.com/TFU.INFO. Help support the show. Join up at any level, and you get 2 bonus entries into the giveaway contest. Now, of course, if you want to keep up with the show, you want to keep up with the podcast, make sure you subscribe. Whatever you're listening to it on iTunes, Google Play, you know the drill. Subscribe, and you get the episodes almost as soon as they appear, as now the folks over on Patreon are going to get at least a day before. Of course, if you want to keep up with the show, catch us on most of the big social media networks: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Patreon, those sites.com/TFU.INFO, Twitter, TFU_info, and of course on the web at www.tfu.info. Lastly, if you want to help the figure archive at the website, swing on by to tfu.info/help for more details. And once again, thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting the show. I would not be able to do this show without your help and without your appreciation. So thank you for leaving nice reviews on iTunes and Google Play. Thank you for liking the show and liking anything we do here at TFU.INFO, it really does mean a lot to me. So I've got a bunch of these episodes planned out on paper, and next week we're going to jump into, ultimately, the reason for any of these cartoons and comics existing. And that's right, we're jumping into the toys from 1985. So make sure you keep it here, and until next time, see you.